What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time. I'm Collin of 97.5 The Fanatic and 93.3 WMMR. Coming to you weekly for now with the Philly Sports Talk podcast. This is episode 5, and you can check out the pilot episode and some quick hitters in our podcast feed. I'm real excited that we're on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts now, hoping to get on most social media channels by the end of the week. Also going to be at the Sixers practice facility on Thursday. That's for a broadcast with Mike Missinelli. Yes, he's returned to 97.5 The Fanatic. But we'll be at Mike's show in Camden over at 76 Place on Thursday, dedicating the new court. And I hope to get some good audio to send your way on next week's show. Today I want to do an evergreen topic. Yes, one of those evergreens that never goes stale. And I want to do a fun Flyers topic, reminding you that there is some ice in August. Before I dive into it, I wanted to talk a little bit about the Phillies and an article that's about to go on 975thefanatic.com. It's about analysis of the starting pitching, which is a fading identity of those first half Phillies that got off to that great start and kind of morphed into this beat-up second half team that you've seen lose 7 of 22 coming out of the All-Star break. I think the crux of this article, the real best part here, is about balancing panic heading into Red October versus dissatisfaction with August performance. Those are two different things, and over the course of a long season in Major League Baseball, 162 games, I think a lot of fans can kind of blend the two and maybe forget that they're not always one and the same. So read that on 975thefanatic.com. It's going to come out late Tuesday night, so grab that when you can. And it's going to include the update on Ranger Suarez and how he feels after he throws at Citizens Bank Park on Tuesday afternoon. But to the focus of the show, I wanted to talk about the history of Flyers captains. And now this is an article from 975thefanatic.com that went up in March of 2024. Why the timing? It's because Sean Couturier was named the new Flyers captain. After they left that seat vacant for a little while, John Tortorella put the C on Sean Couturier's chest. Of course, this was before the John Tortorella saga, just over a month later, when the coach benched his captain while he was struggling with an injury and for some reason didn't point to the injury as the reason why he was out of the lineup. So that part is interestingly not included, but I'm going to break down my perception of each of the Flyers captains dating back to Eric Lindros, who took the C in 1994. Why am I skipping to 1994? Easy, because I have no memory of any Flyers teams before Eric Lindros got that C. Stay tuned for it on the other side of the break.
If it's happening in Philly sports, Collin Newby's talking about it. Go with him behind the scenes of legendary sports venues with the best athletes and the most iconic media personalities of the greatest sports city in the world.
What's up, Philadelphia? Welcome back to First Time, Long Time, where we're jumping right into the meat of the episode, and that's going to start with the Eric Lindros captaincy. But to really understand how that captaincy rose to the top and then all fell apart in 2000, you got to look back at 1991, when Eric Lindros came to the NHL as one of the best prospects in the league's history. Right, he was supposed to be the next Wayne Gretzky, and you saw guys like Mario Lemieux and these other stars in the 1980s putting up crazy point totals. Eric Lindros was going to be the next guy, but he refused to play for the Quebec Nordiques, who had the number 1 overall pick in that 1991 draft. So they got Lindros, but they end up trading him to the Flyers just over a year later for a big package that included actually another Flyers captain that wouldn't come into orange and black until years down the line. But when Lindros took over the captaincy, the Flyers had just gone through a pretty dormant period of their franchise. You all know the history of the Broad Street Bullies really established the identity of the Flyers back in the 70s, but after that dynasty kind of faded, the Flyers were still a very good franchise in the 80s. They reached the Stanley Cup a few times just to fall short, and especially of those Edmonton Oilers Cups in 1985 and 1987, the Flyers stayed at the top of the NHL mantle. But after that, they really faded. They missed the playoffs for 5 consecutive seasons from 1990 through 94. And towards the end of that down period, you get a guy like Eric Lindros, who's coming into the league as the next big thing, and it gets people excited. He's the face of the franchise, the guy who's going to be the superstar who gets you back into Stanley Cup contention. So that was the perception among the Philadelphia fan base, and the Flyers decided to slap the C on him going into the 94-95 season. That was, of course, the lockout shortened campaign right over after Gary Bettman had taken over as NHL commissioner. But Lindros was excellent that season. He ended up winning the Hart Trophy. Everybody looked at it as the breakout that was going to be this new era. The Flyers ended up losing in the Eastern Conference Final to the New Jersey Devils, the eventual Cup champions, but they established themselves in the top tier of the NHL to where they were going to make deep playoff runs over the next 10 years or so, and really that era of the franchise extended all the way to about 2012. Eric Lindros had a ton of injury issues throughout his career, but in those years, 95, 96, 97, he developed into exactly what people thought he was going to be. He was the face of the Flyers and one of the faces of the NHL. This is when Wayne Gretzky was reaching the later years of his career. He still had a lot left and bounced around to a few different teams. But Eric Lindros was the younger guy stepping into those big shoes. Mario Lemieux is kind of in the same boat as Gretzky. He was probably not at his peak, still a superstar, but really not at the peak of his game, the talent level that made him a Hall of Famer and one of the best ever to lace up the skates. It looked like those guys were going to kind of hand the NHL over to Eric Lindros. When the Flyers reached the 1997 Cup Final, everybody in Philadelphia thought it had peaked. They were favored over the Detroit Red Wings, but they ended up getting swept. That was when Terry Murray referred to his team as a bunch of chokers. The Flyers, being one of the most chaotic franchises in professional sports, ended up firing their coach after making it to the final. After that, there was a lot of drama, a lot of controversy, and I think that's what people remember about Eric Lindros almost more than anything. The concussion started in the late 90s. You've probably seen those grainy YouTube clips of Darius Kasparaitis drilling Lindros, causing these concussions. And remember, this is in a different era of professional sports where head injuries weren't always these terrible taboo topics that needed to be so sensitive about. Not as much was known about head trauma, about CTE. You didn't have these stories that have now come up through the 2000s and things that most sports fans are familiar with today. So when you're face of the franchise, your captain, the superstar Eric Lindros, is nursing head injuries off on the sidelines, a lot of people are going to ask questions. And it's funny, I remember a old clip from Steve Levy of ESPN. He was on SportsCenter talking about how there's a perception around the NHL that Eric Lindros was soft for missing games. Can you imagine a SportsCenter anchor saying that now? There's an indicator of just how different things were when Eric Lindros was suffering through these concussions back in the late 90s and into the 2000 playoffs. And that season, that's of course what everybody remembers. The Flyers didn't have Lindros on the ice for most of that playoff run, but they got on a roll there. They won in the early rounds, of course, that 5 overtime game winner by Keith Primeau against the Pittsburgh Penguins. They got up on the New Jersey Devils 3-1 in the Eastern Conference Final right around the time Lindros was ready to come back into the mix. Of course, what happened after that is what people remember. Take a listen to one of the most brutal moments in franchise history.
Here's 88. Lindros makes the move, and Lindros is hammered down to the ice by Scott Stevens. And Lindros remains down on the ice as all the other players come together.
Oh, boy. Oh boy, this is the worst case scenario here for Eric Lindros. Stevens came across like he has done so often in the playoff. He comes across as a lefty and he slides through the middle, catching you with your head down. It's an art form for Scott Stevens.
Scott Stevens was a great hockey player, but that hit might have stepped over the line. His intimidation factor was second to none. He was the Devils captain back in this time. But when he hit Eric Lindros, that was his final play with the Flyers. It looked like his career might be over at the time. It actually wasn't. He played for the Toronto Maple Leafs, the New York Rangers, but Eric Lindros was never the same as he was before those concussions after these hits piled up, and Scott Stevens effectually ended Lindros' reign as a superstar. Who did the Flyers give the C to after Eric Lindros? Well, it was Eric Desjardins, who had worn the A for the majority of that period in the late 90s, alongside Rod Brind'Amour, but Brind'Amour had just been traded for Keith Primeau, the man who scored that dramatic 5-overtime winner. Now, the Flyers, in typical dramatic fashion, couldn't just quietly place the C on somebody else. They had to strip it off on television, on live television. And Bobby Clarke, well, he might have been the best captain in franchise history back in the 1970s, but he didn't handle himself with the best maturity through all of that. He did some things that he probably regrets with Lindros, but I have heard people since and removed from this entire era say that they don't regret the overall picture that did happen with Lindros, the trade back in 1992, the success they had in the mid and late 90s. The Flyers did a lot of good things back then, and they really got back on the map as NHL contenders and a franchise that was expected to be in the mix for the Stanley Cup for a very long time, and really over a year-by-year basis. Lindros wasn't around for that entire period, but I think he's what initiated the new era of Flyers hockey. So when people look back at that trade, they might see Peter Forsberg and a few other pieces around him, Mike Ricci, Ron Hextall, and say that the Flyers lost that trade with the Quebec Nordiques. You can make that case, but overall, the Eric Lindros era in Philadelphia was a success, at least in my mind, and I think the general attitude of people that have been around the organization for a very long time, and some of them still within the organization, I think they share that sentiment. After the Flyers lost Eric Lindros, they stayed towards the top as one of the best teams in the Eastern Conference, but they had some disappointing playoff exits in the early 2000s. Lost 2 years in a row to the Ottawa Senators, if you remember those Patrick Lalime series. The one series went 5 games, and the Flyers scored 2 goals because Lalime dominated them. But Eric Desjardins wore the C for a majority of that era, but he ends up handing it to Keith Primeau in 2001. Now, it's important to remember what an NHL captaincy actually entails. You are in name the captain, in name the leader of the team, but that doesn't always necessarily translate exactly into what happens in an NHL locker room. And Eric Desjardins, when he handed the C over to Keith Primeau, he understood that. Primeau was already the vocal leader of the team. He was the top center at that point and the best player in most regards. So it really just made logical sense to put him in charge and make it official and put the C on him. So Desjardins had a quick run there. The Flyers didn't go on many playoff runs with him wearing the C, but he did serve a good place in Flyers history, first as the assistant during the Lindros years and a pretty brief captaincy in 99, 2000, and 2001. When you got to Keith Primeau, that's a little bit of a bizarre legacy in Flyers history. There was actually a lot of points in time where people didn't consider Primeau a playoff scorer. They slapped the old moniker on him of a choker. He doesn't show up when the games matter most. Well, he kind of reversed that narrative over the years. First one was in that 2000 run where he scored the 5 overtime goal against the Penguins. He was, of course, a big part of that team that ended up reaching the Eastern Conference Final against the Devils. But the goal I really remember from Primeau was in Game 6 of the 2004 Eastern Conference Final, and that was against John Tortorella, of all people. John Tortorella and the Tampa Bay Lightning. Remember back in that era with Vinny LeCavalier, Marty St. Louis. Keith Primeau and Simone Gagne scored 2 of the most dramatic goals I've ever seen to set the Philadelphia crowd on fire in Game 6 of that series and send it back to 7 in Tampa Bay, which they, of course, ultimately lost. But I still consider that one of the best games in Flyers history. That top line with Primeau and Gagne completed a dramatic comeback there.
Holding, hanging, slashing. It all goes with 2:07 to go. Gagne takes the hit. Roenick, Primeau moved into the help. 2 minutes left to go in the third period. Tampa Bay leading at 4-3. All the scoring coming in the first 2 periods. Primeau got it away to Tamander. A shot.
St. Louis will make a hand pass to Dave Andrechuk. Up the boards, right there. It went by Andrechuk to Tamander. His shot got by Hobby Bullen. Went off to the one side, and Keith Primeau danced out to the empty side and has dramatically tied this game.
Forced Tampa Bay to 7, but they just didn't have enough left to get back to the Stanley Cup final. Ended up losing to Tortorella, the eventual champions, and that was actually the last playoff before the NHL canceled the season in 2004-2005. They were the first major professional sports league in North America to do that. So it was a shame heading into the lockout that it had to be that way. But at least you got that one memory with Keith Primeau heading into that lockout. But the Flyers end up making some moves coming out, one of them being Derian Hatcher. And Hatcher was the big defenseman with the Dallas Stars previously. He helped them to the Stanley Cup in 1999, all those teams under Ken Hitchcock. So when the Flyers came out of the lockout, they didn't actually have a captain at first, but they end up slapping the C on Derian Hatcher pretty early on. And this is right as Sidney Crosby was coming into the league with the Pittsburgh Penguins. He had a famous bout with Hatcher early in his career, ends up scoring the game winner in overtime, and that was pretty much when the Flyers and the Penguins became arch rivals. Hatcher kind of picked a fight with this rookie, a guy that the Flyers probably looked at as somebody who didn't deserve much of the attention because he was such a young player. But that's one of the biggest moments in Flyers-Penguins history, and Derian Hatcher was a big part of it, whether that's a positive thing or not. He only held the captaincy for a little while there, but he did hang around long enough to play on that 2008 team that, again, went to the Eastern Conference Final, theme here. They lost to the Pittsburgh Penguins that year. That was when Sidney Crosby was coming into his prime. They reached the Stanley Cup for the first time. They did lose to the Red Wings, but they ended up beating the Red Wings in a rematch a year later. After Derian Hatcher moved on from the C, the Flyers gave it to Peter Forsberg, another big addition they made out of the 04-05 lockout. And Forsberg at the time was considered one of the best players in the world. By the time he got to Philadelphia, he didn't really have that form left in him. He was past his prime age, probably still at the peak of his skill, but Forsberg struggled with injuries in Philadelphia. He was very skilled with the puck. He was the same crafty Swede that put up those big seasons with the Colorado Avalanche in the late 90s and early 2000s, but he just wasn't that healthy. They wanted him to be the centerpiece of the Flyers in that era, and it didn't work out because of injuries more so than anything. When Forsberg missed a lot of that terrible season in 06-07, Paul Holmgren ended up sending him to the Nashville Predators, and that was a little bit of a complex series of moves there. It wasn't a direct trade, but that series of moves ultimately brought Kimmo Timonen and Scott Hartnell to Philadelphia. So the Peter Forsberg era didn't work out the way the Flyers planned, but at least they did salvage something there. Got two players that had a lot of good years with them afterwards. The Forsberg trade under Paul Holmgren wasn't the only big move there, though. The Flyers really loaded up after that disastrous 06-07 season, which was their worst point total in franchise history. In 07-08, you remember that "Back with a Vengeance" slogan that they put on the team? Well, part of those moves that led to the "Back with a Vengeance" attitude, signing Jason Smith. Now, Smith was never going to be any kind of star player in Philadelphia. He was a good defenseman for only one season, but they got him almost just to wear the C, it seemed like. And he did it well. He helped the team to the Eastern Conference Final. But Smith was kind of what they needed at that point. He was more of a glue guy, a good veteran to have in the room, even though he wasn't going to be the biggest contributor on the ice. But after they let Smith go, then came one of the most interesting stories in franchise history. Mike Richards took over the captaincy at just 23 years old, and the same organization that ripped the C off of Lindros's chest just less than a decade earlier experienced some more drama with such a young captain. The Flyers thought they had the next Bobby Clarke with Mike Richards. They thought he was this hard-nosed player who was a skilled scorer, but also the most gritty, intense player that could be the captain that got them back to Stanley Cup glory, even if he wasn't as big of a superstar as Eric Lindros or some of the best players in the NHL at that time, like Sidney Crosby and Alex Ovechkin, once they were coming into their prime. Mike Richards had about 100 incidents in Sea Isle City while he was the captain of the Flyers. Just ask pretty much anybody that's ever vacationed there. They'll tell you some sort of story about Mike Richards at a Sea Isle bar, and I gotta just wrap it up in the most simplistic way. None of them are very good stories. But Paul Holmgren ended up dealing away Mike Richards and Jeff Carter in the summer of 2011. That was a stunner at the time. The Flyers had just gone to the Stanley Cup in 2010, and Richards was a huge part of it. Just over a year later, he deals away Richards, the captain, and Jeff Carter, one of the top scorers on that team. So Flyers fans will always have the good years in their memory, the early years of Mike Richards when he came up and earned that C, and they'll have the 2009 run to where they were a playoff team, the 2010 run with that crazy comeback against the Boston Bruins in the second round, down 0-3 to come back and win in Game 7, and then the series victory over the Montreal Canadiens, the heartbreaking loss to the Blackhawks in the Cup. But Mike Richards, one of the more polarizing figures in Flyers history, I would say, and one of the most interesting stories, especially when you tie it into the captaincy and the history throughout the franchise. After the Flyers traded Mike Richards in that summer of 2011, it was pretty obvious who they were going to give the C to. It was Chris Pronger. Pronger was still one of the best defensemen in the NHL at that time, even though he was 35 years old, I believe, when he took over the captaincy. But he was the obvious choice. He was on that 2010 team that went to the Stanley Cup, and I remember him being described as the general. Yeah, Mike Richards was the captain, but Pronger, I think he kind of filled that same role that I just talked about with Keith Primo a little bit, where he was the voice in the room. He was the real leader of the Flyers, even though that didn't really need to be an insult on Mike Richards. Pronger was just kind of the natural leader there. The terrible part about Chris Pronger is that he only wore the C for 13 games with the Flyers. He had that injury that ended his career early in the 11-12 season, and the Flyers haven't even really replaced him since. He was a number one defenseman at that time. Of course, this big blue liner who was so physical and good in his own end, and also this great offensive defenseman who had a great shot from the blue line. He was a good puck mover with that stride in his own end and in the neutral zone. And the Flyers have had Shane Gostisbehere, Ivan Provorov, a couple good defensemen since, but nobody that's even close to the level of Chris Pronger. So he wasn't the most storied captain, only playing 13 games, but he was one of the most successful NHL players ever to wear the Flyers uniform. The Flyers went without a captain for the rest of that season in 2011-12, but that's the year that Claude Giroux really broke out and became the team leader, the centerpiece of the franchise, that top-line center and superstar that they had been missing in the previous season. The Flyers hope for a new era again with Claude Giroux as the captain. Remember, it was that lockout-shortened season in 12-13. They only played 48 games, but when they first agreed on the new CBA to come out of the lockout, the Flyers put the C on Giroux right away, headed into the new season, and he seemed like the obvious choice. He was really one of the best players in the NHL at that point. He had broken out, become one of the top scorers, but it wasn't really about Claude Giroux in the coming years. The Flyers had made a lot of mistakes leading up to that point. They really didn't have much depth on the roster. Just talked about the lack of big defensemen after Chris Pronger went down. Well, they didn't have many depth forwards either. They ended up getting Steve Mason, a decent goaltender, a couple years later, but he wasn't some star goalie that was going to lead the Flyers to a Stanley Cup. And Giroux kind of got left on an island at certain points. He had some good wingers at certain times during his career, Jacob Voracek especially. You also had Wayne Simmons. He was sometimes on the first line with Giroux, but more of a second-line player. You also had success from Scott Hartnell in that era, but the Flyers never put a full team around Claude Giroux that really gave him a legitimate chance to win a Stanley Cup, and that's why you saw such mediocrity while Giroux was the captain. So when you see the results before Giroux was the captain, where the Flyers are going on these deep playoff runs, all those times I somehow mentioned that they got to the Eastern Conference Final and then fell apart. Well, Giroux didn't lead them that far. He led them to the playoffs every other year in a bizarre pattern, but I wouldn't blame it on him, the fact that the Flyers didn't make any deep playoff runs. And then when those Chuck Fletcher moves started to really blow up in their face after the pandemic in 2020, the Flyers ended up trading Claude Giroux in 2022 at the March deadline in the deal that brought Owen Tippett to the Flyers. And that was a weird circumstance too. Giroux didn't really seem like he wanted to leave Philadelphia. He was comfortable. He's a franchise legend, so it makes sense. But he played his 1,000th game with the Flyers in March of 2022, and it just so happened to be his last game with the Flyers. Everybody in the arena knew it that night. He was getting traded in the next couple of days. But Claude Giroux has a strange legacy with the Flyers because of things primarily outside his control. I don't want to say everything was outside his control because that's not how sports works. But I wouldn't say that the Claude Giroux legacy has as much to do with Claude Giroux as it does with the Flyers organization as a whole. After that trade that brought a young player like Owen Tippett to Philadelphia, the Flyers again left the captaincy vacant for a little while. They had lost Claude Giroux and they wanted to move into a different feeling in the organization as a whole that avoided complacency. Just naming a new leader and putting the nearest person in charge wasn't really a good way to do that. The Flyers have emphasized culture so much since all of these events happened that they wanted to promote a culture of somebody stepping into a leadership role. And that's why they didn't hand it to Sean Couturier in the first place. Plus, he dealt with a lot of injuries at this point, and he wasn't really on the ice that much to take it. I think Scott Lawton took over a big leadership role in his absence, but John Tortorella decided to name Sean Couturier the captain officially in 2024. The Flyers were on a playoff run at that point. They were in playoff position, I should say. They ended up blowing it down the stretch with a bad losing streak in the final weeks of the season. But they have Sean Couturier as their captain, their guy for the future. He is on a long-term contract, even though he is probably past the best years of his NHL career. The Flyers are going to look at his contributions in a leadership lens almost as much as they're going to look at his contributions offensively. And for a former Selke Trophy winner, I guess you could say defensively also, even though he is one of the top centers on the roster. That's going to do it for First Time, Long Time this week. Check back next Tuesday. I'm Collin Newby of 97.5 The Fanatic and 93.3 WMMR.